The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, its golden sands shimmering like molten metal under the relentless sun. Mark, Sophie, Jason, and Emily stood at the edge of the vast expanse, staring into the void that seemed to swallow the horizon. The heat radiated like a living force, already testing their resolve. "Out there lies Ubar, the Atlantis of the sands," Sophie said, adjusting her wide-brimmed hat. Her voice was filled with a mix of excitement and unease. "If the legends are true, it's the discovery of a lifetime." "You mean the city cursed by angry gods?" Jason quipped, rolling his eyes. "We're chasing ghost stories." Emily, busy adjusting the settings on her camera, smirked. "Ghost stories sell, Jason. Besides, think of the photos we'll get. My editor will love this." "Mysterious lost cities? This is gold." Mark, the group's leader and a seasoned adventurer, checked his map one last time. "Enough chatter. We've got 3 days of supplies and a long way to go. Stay hydrated and keep your gear close." The group began their journey into the desert, the sound of their boots crunching on the hot sand echoing into the emptiness. The oppressive heat bore down on them, the horizon shimmering as if the earth itself were melting under the sun. Around them, the vast emptiness seemed to amplify every sound. Their footsteps, the rustle of their gear, even the occasional nervous laugh. By midday, the sun hung mercilessly above them, and their shadows shrank to barely visible smudges on the sand. Sophie kept glancing at her compass, her brow furrowing with every glance. "That's strange," she muttered under her breath. "What's strange?" Jason asked, his tone laced with impatience as he wiped sweat from his brow. "The compass, it's not working. The needle keeps spinning, like it's trying to find something but can't." Jason shrugged dismissively. "Probably just a cheap knockoff. We'll find our way without it." Mark overheard the exchange and stopped abruptly, turning to face the group. "Compass issues in the middle of the desert aren't something to joke about. This isn't some casual hike. Stay alert. We don't have room for mistakes." The wind began to pick up, carrying with it a faint, eerie sound. At first, it was easy to dismiss it as the natural whistle of air through the dunes. But then Emily stopped, turning her head sharply toward the sound. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Mark replied, his eyes scanning the horizon. It sounded like someone calling my name," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly as her eyes darted across the dunes. Jason laughed, though it was a thin, nervous sound. "It's just the wind. Don't let the desert get to you, Emily." But Emily wasn't convinced. The sound seemed to echo in her mind, an impossible familiarity in the voice. As the day stretched into late afternoon, the heat began to ease, but the atmosphere grew heavier. The golden sands seemed darker, almost shadowed, even though no clouds marred the clear sky. By nightfall, they reached an old outpost, a crumbling shack with a rusted metal roof that looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. Inside, they found an elderly man hunched over a table, his leathery skin nearly blending with the dim, flickering lantern light. "You shouldn't have come here," the old man rasped without looking up. His voice was barely audible, yet it sent chills down their spines. Mark stepped forward, his voice steady but cautious. "We're just passing through. We're looking for Ubar." The old man's head snapped up, his hollow eyes locking onto Mark's. "Ubar isn't a city, it's a graveyard. Turn back now, while you still can." Jason scoffed, trying to mask his unease. "Right. Thanks for the warning, old-timer. Let's not waste time on desert legends." The man's gaze shifted to Sophie, his expression grave. "The desert knows you. It knows all of you. It remembers your sins." Emily shuddered, gripping her camera tightly. "What does that even mean?" The old man didn't answer. Instead, he repeated his warning, his voice trembling. "Go back, before it's too late." Ignoring him, the group set up camp just beyond the outpost. The whispers returned as they lay in their tents, louder this time, circling them like predators in the dark. None of them slept. The first rays of dawn crept over the dunes, painting the sand in hues of gold and crimson. Despite the beauty of the desert morning, The group was far from at ease. None of them had slept, and the tension was palpable as they broke camp. "Let's get moving," Mark said, his voice sharp. He glanced at the horizon, where the sun was already climbing. "The sooner we find Ubar, the sooner we can get out of here." As they trudged deeper into the desert, the terrain seemed to shift unnaturally. The dunes appeared to ripple and change as though they were alive. Emily paused to snap a photo of a strange pattern etched into the sand, a series of concentric circles that seemed to pulse faintly in the morning light. "This is weird," she muttered, showing the image to Sophie. Sophie frowned, tracing the pattern in the sand with her finger. "It looks ancient, but I've never seen anything like it before." Jason, walking a few steps ahead, turned back and scoffed. "Great. Now the sand has graffiti. Let's not waste time." But the deeper they went, the stranger things became. The wind carried faint whispers, low and unintelligible, like a distant chant. The temperature dropped despite the rising sun, and an eerie stillness settled over the group. By midday, the group stopped to rest, but the unease only grew. The horizon seemed closer than before, as if the desert was closing in around them. Jason suddenly dropped his pack and cursed, looking around frantically. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, alarmed. "My water bottle," Jason stammered, holding it up. It was filled with sand. "That's impossible," Sophie said, examining her own supplies. To their growing horror, they found that most of their water bottles had turned into sand overnight. "This doesn't make sense," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Nothing about this place makes sense," Mark growled, his fist clenching. "We'll ration what's left. Keep moving." As they continued, Jason began to fall behind, his steps faltering. He rubbed his temples and shook his head as if trying to clear it. I hear something," he said, his voice barely audible. "We all hear the whispers," Mark replied impatiently. "No," Jason insisted, his eyes darting around. "It's different. It's my mother's voice." The group froze. "Jason, your mother passed away years ago," Sophie said cautiously. Jason nodded, his breathing uneven. "I know, but it's her voice. She's calling me. She's asking me to follow her." "Don't," Mark said firmly, gripping Jason's arm. "It's a trick. This place is messing with our heads." But Jason wrenched free, his eyes wild. "You don't understand. She needs me." He bolted into the dunes before anyone could stop him. "Jason!" Emily screamed, but he was already gone. They chased after him, but the desert seemed to conspire against them. The shifting sand swallowed their tracks, and Jason's form disappeared over a dune. When they reached the spot where he'd vanished, there was nothing, no footprints, no sign of him at all. "He's gone," Emily said, tears streaming down her face. "We'll find him," Mark said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We have to keep moving." As the day wore on, they stumbled upon a massive stone tablet partially buried in the sand. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, glowing faintly in the dimming light. Sophie knelt to examine it, her fingers tracing the carvings. This is a warning," she said, her voice shaking. "It speaks of a guardian, something that protects the city from intruders." "What kind of guardian?" Emily asked nervously. Before Sophie could answer, a low, guttural growl rumbled through the air. The group turned, their hearts racing, but saw nothing. "We need to go," Mark said, his voice tight. They pressed on as night fell, the desert growing colder and more hostile. The whispers grew louder, forming words they couldn't understand but instinctively feared. The moon cast long shadows across the sand, and every movement in the corner of their vision felt like a threat. When they stopped to rest, Emily froze, staring into the distance. "Do you see that?" she whispered. Mark followed her gaze and saw a figure standing atop a distant dune. It was humanoid but unnaturally tall, its body blending into the shifting sands as though it were part of the desert itself. Its head turned toward them, and even from afar, they felt its gaze pierce through them. "We need to leave," Sophie said, her voice trembling. They packed up hastily, but the figure began to move, gliding toward them with impossible speed. The group broke into a run, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as the sand seemed to pull at their feet. They stumbled into a canyon, its walls lined with strange, glowing carvings. The whispers were deafening now, and the air felt thick and oppressive. "This must be it," Sophie said, pointing to the carvings. "We're close to the city." Emily looked back, her eyes wide with terror. And so is that thing. The figure loomed at the canyon's entrance, its form now clearer. It was monstrous, its body shifting and writhing like living sand. Its eyes glowed a malevolent red, and its growl resonated like thunder. The group scrambled deeper into the canyon, their fear driving them forward. But the deeper they went, the more the carvings seemed to come alive, their glowing light pulsating like a heartbeat. The desert wasn't just a place, it was alive, and it wanted them. The canyon walls seemed to close in around them, the glowing carvings pulsating like veins under the desert skin. The whispers that had haunted them all day grew louder, now forming words they could almost understand, though they wished they couldn't. Mark led the way, his flashlight casting shaky beams on the ancient symbols. "We keep moving. Whatever that thing is, we can't let it catch us." Behind him, Emily clutched her camera tightly, her breath shallow. Sophie was reading the carvings as they went, her voice trembling. "These aren't just warnings. They're instructions. Rituals. Offerings." "Offerings?" Emily asked, her voice barely audible. Sophie nodded, her face pale. "To appease the guardian. To survive." The growl of the creature echoed behind them, reverberating through the canyon like a physical force. Emily turned to look back and gasped. The figure was closer now, its shifting form towering above the canyon walls, blending with the sand and shadows. "Run," Mark shouted, grabbing Sophie's arm and pulling her forward. The group sprinted through the narrow canyon, the light from their flashlights flickering as if the air itself was trying to extinguish them. The whispers grew deafening, overlapping into a cacophony of voices, each one accusing, taunting, and pleading. They stumbled into a wide chamber carved into the canyon, where the ground was littered with ancient artifacts, broken pottery, shattered weapons, and what looked disturbingly like human bones. In the center of the chamber was a massive stone altar, its surface stained dark with centuries-old blood. "This is it," Sophie said, panting. "The heart of the city. The altar." Mark's eyes darted around the chamber. "How do we stop it? How do we make it leave us alone?" Sophie scanned the carvings on the altar, her voice shaking as she read aloud. "An offering must be made to the sands, to the guardian. A life must be given willingly." Emily froze, her face draining of color. "You're joking. You have to be joking." Before Sophie could respond, the chamber darkened as the guardian entered, its monstrous form blocking the light of the moon. Its glowing red eyes locked onto them, and the sand around its body writhed like living tendrils. Mark stepped forward, his voice firm. "We're not dying here. There has to be another way." The guardian let out a guttural roar, and the sand beneath their feet began to move, pulling them toward the altar. Mark grabbed Emily and Sophie, pulling them back, but the sand was relentless, dragging them inch by inch. Emily screamed as the sand wrapped around her legs, pulling her toward the altar. "It's going to kill us." Sophie's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the carvings. "It wants one of us. That's the only way." "No," Mark shouted. "We're not sacrificing anyone. We can fight it." The guardian roared again, and the sand surged upward, forming ghostly faces that screamed in unison. Mark grabbed a piece of broken pottery and hurled it at the creature, but it passed through its body like smoke. "Mark, it's not going to stop," Sophie said, her voice breaking. Emily, tears streaming down her face, looked at the altar and then back at her friends. "If one of us doesn't do it, it'll take all of us." "No," Mark shouted, stepping in front of her. Emily shook her head, a sad smile on her face. "I'll do it. You two get out of here." Before anyone could stop her, Emily broke free from the sand's grip and climbed onto the altar. The moment she stood there, the sand released its hold on Mark and Sophie, retreating like a tide. The guardian paused, its glowing eyes fixed on Emily. For a moment, the whispers stopped, and the desert fell silent. Emily looked at Mark and Sophie, tears in her eyes. "Tell my story." The sand surged upward, engulfing Emily as she let out a final, piercing scream. The guardian roared triumphantly, and the carvings on the walls glowed brighter than ever before. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the creature dissolved into the sand, disappearing into the desert. Mark and Sophie collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The chamber grew still, the whispers fading into an eerie silence. "We have to go," Mark said, pulling Sophie to her feet. They stumbled out of the canyon, their legs barely holding them up. The desert was no longer shifting or alive, but its emptiness felt even more oppressive. When they finally reached the edge of the desert, the sun was rising, casting long shadows across the dunes. Sophie looked back, her face etched with grief. "It's over, isn't it?" Mark didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the sand seemed to ripple unnaturally. But as they turned to leave, the faint sound of Emily's voice echoed on the wind. "Don't forget me." The desert stretched behind them like a terrible, endless nightmare, yet its silence lingered in their minds. Mark and Sophie didn't speak as they trudged toward civilization, their bodies weak and their spirits shattered. The rising sun offered no warmth, only a harsh, unforgiving light that revealed their exhaustion. Sophie clutched her satchel tightly, the ancient carvings she'd copied from the canyon weighing on her mind. Her thoughts raced, replaying Emily's sacrifice over and over. She could still see her friend standing on the altar, her terrified yet resolute face illuminated by the glowing sand. Mark walked ahead, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He hadn't spoken since they'd left the canyon, his silence as oppressive as the desert's heat. Sophie wanted to say something, anything, but words felt hollow in the wake of what they'd endured. As they reached the edge of the desert, the landscape began to change. Sparse vegetation appeared, and the air grew less dry. The sight of a small, dilapidated gas station on the horizon brought a glimmer of hope. "We made it," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. Mark didn't respond. He merely nodded and quickened his pace, his movements mechanical. The gas station was eerily quiet. Its faded sign creaked in the breeze, and the single pump stood rusted and unused. Inside, a dusty counter and a row of empty shelves hinted at years of abandonment. Sophie collapsed into a chair, her body giving out at last. She pulled a bottle of water from the dusty fridge, ignoring the expiration date, and took a long, desperate sip. Mark stood by the window, staring out at the desert. "We shouldn't have come here," he said finally, his voice low and hoarse. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed. "We didn't know, Mark. We couldn't have known." Mark's jaw tightened. "But we should have listened. The old man warned us." "Emily didn't have to," he trailed off, his fists clenching. Sophie's gaze dropped to her hands. "She saved us. She knew what had to be done." The room fell silent again, the weight of Emily's absence pressing down on them. Sophie reached into her bag and pulled out her notes, spreading them across the table. "These carvings," she said, her voice steadying. "They weren't just warnings. They were part of a larger story, a curse. The city, the guardian, it was never meant to be found. The desert protects it for a reason." Mark turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "So what happens now? We survived. The guardian is gone. It's over, isn't it?" Sophie hesitated. "I don't know." The whispers stopped, and the desert let us go. But curses don't just disappear. As if in response, a faint, chilling breeze swept through the gas station. Sophie shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. Mark's eyes darted to the window, his body tensing. "That's not possible," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Sophie followed his gaze. In the distance, the sand began to ripple unnaturally, the movement subtle but undeniable. The whispers returned, faint and fragmented, carried on the wind like distant cries for help. "No," Sophie whispered, her heart sinking. Mark grabbed her arm. "We're leaving. Now." They hurried outside, their exhaustion forgotten in the face of a renewed terror. The desert, so still moments ago, seemed alive again, its shifting sand spreading like a disease. As they climbed into an old, rusted pickup truck parked beside the gas station, the whispers grew louder. Sophie froze as she heard a familiar voice among them, Emily's voice, faint but unmistakable. "Don't leave me." Mark slammed the truck into gear, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. The engine roared to life, and they sped away from the gas station, leaving the cursed desert behind. But even as they drove farther from the dunes, the whispers didn't fade. They clung to the edges of their minds, an ever-present reminder of what they had escaped and what they had lost. As they reached the outskirts of a small town, Sophie dared to look back. The desert loomed in the distance, silent and still, as if waiting. Mark parked the truck in front of a diner, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "We're done," he said, his voice trembling. "No more expeditions. No more cursed places. We're done." Sophie nodded, though her thoughts were elsewhere. She pulled out her camera, scrolling through the photos Emily had taken before they'd reached the ruins. One image caught her attention, a shot of the altar, taken from afar. In the photo, a faint figure stood on the altar, barely visible through the lens flare. Sophie's breath hitched as she realized it wasn't Emily. It was something else. She quickly turned off the camera, her heart pounding. "We'll never be free of it," she thought, but didn't say aloud. As they stepped into the diner, the warm hum of normalcy enveloped them. The sounds of clinking dishes and murmured conversations felt like a lifeline. But even here, in the safety of civilization, the whispers lingered, faint and persistent. The desert might be behind them, but its curse wasn't. And deep down, they both knew it never would be.